In the shadowed streets of Chicago's South Side, Meredith Lawson, a woman scarred by a past as a nightclub dancer that society would never forgive, scrubbed toilet floors in empty office buildings at 4 a.m, enduring the contemptuous glances and poisonous whispers of her own co-workers. Widowed since a construction accident swallowed her husband 2 years before, Meredith alone supported her 5-year-old son Jamie, accepting daily humiliation as the price of survival. On that autumn morning, while her calloused hands wiped down porcelain for people who would never see her as human, Meredith could not have imagined that her little boy, playing in the dark alleyways near their crumbling apartment, was about to discover a man chained in the basement of an abandoned warehouse, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, and even less, that this encounter would forever transform the destiny of them all, proving that the most unlikely salvation can be born from the very hands that society insists on rejecting. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what moves you most in a mafia romance story. Prepare yourself for a narrative filled with quiet courage, love born from gratitude transformed into devotion, social injustice confronted, and redemption earned where a woman deemed unworthy by hypocritical society will prove that dignity is not measured by titles or past, but by the strength with which one chooses to do good, even when everything conspires against her. If this story touches your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of Meredith and Conrad's journey. Dawn broke slowly over the Chicago horizon, washing a cold gray light through the dust, clinging to the windows of the 20-story office building where Meredith Lawson was finishing the last tasks of her night shift. Her back throbbed in steady waves after 8 straight hours bent over. Her eyes stung from lack of sleep and the sharp sting of industrial cleaning chemicals. She pushed her cart down the empty corridor, its wheels rattling across the cold tile floor, the sound echoing like the weary sigh of a lonely soul. As Meredith passed the employee break room, she heard the familiar murmur of whispers drifting through the thin door. She used to dance at a club, you know. I heard she even sold herself. Filthy thing. No shame at all, coming here to work alongside decent people. The low, malicious giggles of the 2 women pierced through the door like poisoned needles. Meredith didn't slow her steps. She didn't turn her head. Her face remained calm and still, like the surface of an autumn lake untouched by wind. She was used to this. 7 years had passed since she'd left the nightclub on the South Side, yet the shadow of her past still clung to her like a curse that refused to be lifted. For a fleeting moment, her mind drifted back to the darkest days of her life. The image of her mother lying in a hospital bed, her body frail as dry kindling, medical bills stacked high on the table like a mountain. A 21-year-old girl standing for the first time outside the doors of a nightclub, her hands trembling, her tears swallowed back before they could fall. 4 years of dancing beneath blinding colored lights, so her mother could keep breathing. That was the price Meredith had been willing to pay, and she had never once regretted it. The chime of the digital clock pulled her back to the present. 5:45 in the morning. She had to get home before Jamie woke up. Meredith returned the cart to the supply room, changed out of her wrinkled uniform, and walked to the manager's desk to collect her pay. He was a middle-aged man, with a swollen belly and restless eyes, looking her up and down with a gaze that mixed contempt and hunger, taking $20 off. The toilet on the 12th floor wasn't clean, he said, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the desk. Meredith knew the toilet on the 12th floor had shone like glass because she'd scrubbed it 3 times herself, but she didn't argue. Arguing wouldn't change anything except cost her the job. She picked up the worn bills, slipped them into the pocket of her frayed coat, and walked out without a word. The early October wind cut through her like a blade as she made her way down streets, still wrapped in darkness. She stopped at a small bakery just opening its doors and bought the cheapest loaf of bread for $1.50, breakfast for the 2 of them. As she passed St. Patrick's Church, she saw Father Thomas Murphy sweeping fallen golden leaves from the yard. The elderly priest looked up and nodded to her with a gentle smile, his eyes free of judgment. "God bless you, Meredith," he said softly. Meredith smiled in return, and for a moment her heart felt warmer. Father Thomas was the only person in this neighborhood who didn't look at her as though she were a sinner, who didn't whisper behind her back, who didn't pull children aside when she walked by. Their shabby apartment sat on the 4th floor of an aging building that seemed ready to collapse, the wooden stairs creaking beneath each step as though groaning in protest. Meredith paused before the peeling, blotched door, drew in a slow breath, and tried to wipe every trace of exhaustion and bitterness from her face. She smoothed her tangled hair and shaped a small, gentle smile upon her lips. Then she turned the knob and stepped inside, where Jamie lay sleeping beneath warm blankets. Her little boy, the only reason she still had the strength to stand upright against the cruelty of this world. Inside the small apartment, Mrs. Walsh sat in a worn armchair upholstered in faded floral fabric, her wrinkled hands moving swiftly as she knitted a blue sweater for Jamie. She was a childless widow who had lived alone in the apartment across the hall for 20 years, and she had loved Jamie as though he were her own grandson from the day Meredith moved in. When she saw Meredith step inside, she looked up with a gentle smile, placed a finger to her lips to signal silence, and nodded toward the small bedroom where Jamie was still fast asleep. Meredith whispered her thanks, her eyes shining with a gratitude too deep for words. She moved quietly into her son's room, sat on the edge of the bed, and watched him sleep. His brown curls lay scattered across the white pillow, just like Derek's had once been, his round cheeks rising and falling with the steady rhythm of his breathing. Meredith bent down and pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, whispering in a voice thick with emotion that only the darkness could hear. "This is why I endure everything, my son. For you, I can do anything." She lay down beside him, meaning only to close her eyes for a moment, but exhaustion claimed her, and she slept until noon. That afternoon, after Meredith woke and prepared a late lunch for the two of them, Jamie asked for permission to go outside and play. The South Side offered no playgrounds for children, only dirty alleys and walls covered in graffiti. Yet Meredith had no choice but to let him play near the building, with strict instructions not to wander far and to return before nightfall. She stood at the window, watching his small figure disappear around the corner of the alley, then turned back to wash the growing pile of laundry in the basin. Around 5 o'clock, as the sunlight began to fade and long shadows stretched across the cracked pavement, Meredith heard the pounding of hurried footsteps in the hallway. The door burst open, and Jamie rushed inside, his face pale as paper, his whole body trembling as though he had seen a ghost. Meredith ran to him in panic, her hands searching frantically over his body for wounds. "What happened? Who hurt you? Tell me." But Jamie wasn't hurt. His brown eyes were wide and glistening, not with fear but with something else, something Meredith had not expected. "Mama," he said, his voice shaking yet urgent, "there's a man locked in a basement. He's tied up and he's crying. He's all alone down there. It's very dark, Mama." Meredith knelt to his level, gripping his shoulders. "What are you talking about? Where? Where did you go?" Jamie pointed toward the far end of the alley, where an abandoned warehouse stood, a place Meredith had always warned him to avoid. "In that warehouse, Mama, I heard noises, so I went to look. There's stairs going down to a basement, and he's down there." Meredith felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. "You're not to go there again, do you hear me? It's dangerous. That could be a bad man, a criminal being held for some reason. You mustn't get involved in this." But Jamie shook his head so hard his curls flew. "He's not bad, Mama. He talked to me. He said his younger brother betrayed him. He said he's innocent. He didn't do anything wrong." Meredith let out a slow breath, struggling to keep her voice steady. "My child, many bad people say they're innocent. I don't want you in danger." Jamie looked up at her, his eyes clear as autumn rain, and what he said next squeezed Meredith's heart until it hurt. He cried like Daddy used to when he was sad. "Mama, I miss Daddy. I remember Daddy crying when Grandpa died." For several seconds, Meredith couldn't speak. The pain of losing Derek was still raw, like a wound that had never healed. She swallowed her tears and asked in a hoarse whisper, "Did you ask his name?" Jamie nodded. "I did. He said his name is Conrad." Meredith froze as if struck by lightning. Conrad Sterling. That name had filled every news broadcast, every newspaper headline, every hushed conversation across Chicago for the past 2 weeks. The most powerful mafia boss in the city had vanished without a trace, and the police and the FBI were tearing the city apart, searching for him. Yet, in Meredith's mind, another memory rose, one from 9 years ago when she had still been working at the nightclub. That night, a drunken customer had grabbed her by the hair, dragged her into a dark corner with filthy words and roaming hands. She had screamed, but no one came to help. The security guards had stood by, because the man was the son of a wealthy politician. Then a man in a black suit appeared. He hadn't said much, only one quiet sentence to the guard, and the harasser had been dragged out like a stray dog. The man had looked at her once, given a slight nod as if to say, "You're safe now," and then turned and walked away. Later, she learned who he was from the whispers of the other girls. These women work for a living. Anyone who touches them on my territory will face the consequences. Those were Conrad Sterling's words, and it was the only time in Meredith's life that anyone had protected her without asking for anything in return. Meredith looked at her son, then slowly rose and walked to the window, her gaze fixed on the far end of the alley, where the abandoned warehouse was sinking into the shadows of dusk. Inside her, a battle began. Reason told her to forget it, to stay away from mafia affairs, to think of Jamie and their safety. But her heart remembered the eyes of the man from years ago. Eyes that had held no contempt for her despite knowing exactly who she was and what she had been. That night, after tucking Jamie into bed and telling him a fairy tale about a brave knight, Meredith sat by the window and stared into the thick darkness of the alley below. The streetlight flickered weakly, casting ghostly streaks across the cracked pavement. Inside her mind, two voices argued without mercy, like rival attorneys in a courtroom deciding her fate. Reason shouted in sharp panic, "Don't be insane, Meredith. This is mafia business. Who do you think you are to get involved? You have a 5-year-old child to raise. If you die, what happens to Jamie? Forget it. Pretend you don't know anything. That's how you've survived all these years." But her heart whispered in a far gentler tone, "That man once saved you when no one else cared. He didn't know who you were. He didn't ask for anything. He simply did what was right. Now he's in a dark basement, alone, betrayed by his own brother. Can you really turn away?" Then Jamie's voice echoed in her memory, clear and aching. "He cried like Daddy when Daddy was sad. Mama." Meredith closed her eyes, gripping the window frame until her knuckles turned white. She remembered Derek, remembered the way he had wept when his mother died, remembered the helpless loneliness in his eyes. No one deserved that kind of loneliness, not even a mafia boss. At 2 a.m, Meredith made her decision. She quietly opened Jamie's door and looked at her sleeping son one more time, then scribbled a note for Mrs. Walsh in case the older woman came to check in. She put on her old black coat, slipped a small can of pepper spray into her pocket, and stepped out of the apartment in absolute silence. The alley at night was nothing like it was during the day. Darkness swallowed everything, leaving only the unsettling sounds of stray cats and the rustle of rats in the trash. Meredith walked close to the damp walls, her heart pounding so hard it felt as if it might burst from her chest. Her hand clutched the pepper spray, the only weapon she had. The abandoned warehouse loomed ahead like a sleeping beast, its metal roof punctured with holes that allowed thin streams of moonlight to spill onto the cracked concrete floor. The smell of mildew and rust filled her lungs as she slipped through the corroded iron door. Remembering Jamie's description, she found the staircase leading down, hidden beneath old tarps. The basement door was secured with an old but sturdy lock. Meredith pulled a hairpin from her pocket, a skill learned long ago in the slums of her childhood, when she had needed to protect herself and open locked doors to find shelter. After several tense minutes, the lock gave way with a soft click. She pushed the door open, and a heavy stench of dried blood and sweat rushed over her, nearly making her gag. The basement was pitch dark. Meredith used the light from her phone to guide her steps, and then she saw him. Conrad Sterling sat in the corner, his back against a damp concrete wall, his wrists cuffed to a rusted pipe. His clothes were torn, once perhaps an expensive suit, now nothing more than filthy scraps. His face was bruised, his lips cracked and dry with blood, yet his eyes remained sharp and astonishingly alert. When the light fell across his face, Conrad showed no fear, no surprise. He narrowed his eyes at Meredith with strange calm and spoke in a hoarse voice that still carried command. "Who are you? Did Wesley send you? Has he grown impatient and decided to kill me?" Meredith knelt several steps away, keeping a safe distance but close enough for him to see her clearly. "No. My son found you. He's 5 years old." Conrad was silent for a moment, then let out a bitter laugh that echoed through the basement like something rising from hell. "A 5-year-old child, while my empire, hundreds of men, not one of them bothers to look for me." What a joke. Meredith studied him quietly. "What happened to you?" Conrad lifted his head, those eyes searching her face as if weighing whether she could be trusted. At last he sighed, too weary to conceal anything. "Wesley, my brother, he's always envied me, always wanted my position even though I gave him everything. He bribed several of my men, murdered Martin Cross, my business partner of 20 years, and placed the blame on me. He locked me here, waiting until his grip on power is secure before he removes me permanently. He paused, pain flickering through his gaze. Frank Novak, my right hand for 20 years, the only man I trusted completely. Wesley is isolating him. Perhaps he's already dead. I don't know. Meredith listened in silence before asking the question she needed answered. Did you really kill anyone? Did you kill Martin Cross? Conrad looked directly into her eyes, unblinking, unwavering. I've done many bad things in my life, young lady. I'm not a good man. But I didn't kill Martin. He was my friend for 20 years. He's the godfather of my nephew. Meredith rose and turned as if to leave. Conrad didn't beg. He didn't add another word. He simply watched her with the eyes of a man who had accepted fate, who was accustomed to betrayal and disappointment. But Meredith stopped at the basement door, her back still to him. I'll come back. I'll bring you food and water. For the first time, the calm on Conrad's face fractured. Why? You know who I am. You know what kind of man I am. Meredith turned to face him, her expression steady and resolute. 9 years ago, you helped me when no one else would. You didn't know who I was, but you protected me anyway. This is the right thing to do. Then she disappeared into the darkness, leaving Conrad Sterling, the underworld titan, sitting alone in the blackened basement, with his eyes fixed on the space where she had stood, and with a strange emotion stirring inside him. Something he couldn't name. The first time in many years he didn't know what to think. The nights that followed unfolded like a secret dance known only to Meredith and the darkness. Each evening after finishing her shift at the office building, she didn't go straight home. Instead, she slipped toward the abandoned warehouse with a small bundle hidden beneath her coat. Some nights she brought sandwiches from a 24-hour deli. Other nights it was bottled water and a few painkillers. On luckier evenings, she managed to cook warm porridge before work and keep it hot in an old thermos. She learned the habits of the 4 guards Wesley had assigned to watch the warehouse, discovering that between 2 and 3 in the morning they often nodded off, drunk on cheap liquor. That was her golden hour, the narrow window when she could move unseen. In the damp, lightless basement, Meredith and Conrad began to talk more. Their voices were low, barely above whispers, conversations that belonged to the dark and to no one else. He told her about his childhood after his father died young, about carrying the weight of the family at 20 years old, about Wesley whom he had loved and shielded like something precious. She told him about her mother, about the 4 years in the nightclub, about Derek, about Jamie. They were no longer strangers. They were 2 solitary souls who had found each other in misfortune. But on the 7th night, everything nearly unraveled. When Meredith opened the basement door, she found Conrad lying motionless on the cold concrete floor. His body burned with fever, sweat soaking through what remained of his torn shirt. The wound on his shoulder, which she had tried to dress with clean strips of cloth, was badly infected. Yellow pus had spread wide, and the stench rose so sharply she nearly gagged. Conrad was delirious, muttering broken words, his eyes shut tight, his body trembling beyond control. Panic surged through her. Then she forced herself to steady. She ran back out into the night. She knew he needed antibiotics, but the money she had been saving for a month was meant to buy Jamie a new pair of shoes. The soles of his old ones were split, letting in water every time it rained. Meredith stood outside the 24-hour pharmacy, staring into her wallet with shaking hands, then clenched her jaw and stepped inside. Jamie would have to wait another month. She returned to the basement with the medicine and began the longest night of her life. Meredith used clean water and strips torn from her own coat to wash Conrad's wound, enduring the foul smell of infection. She crushed the antibiotic tablets, mixed them with water, and poured it slowly between his cracked lips. She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, wiped the sweat from his face, and changed the cloth again and again as it grew warm from the heat of his fever. In his delirium, Conrad suddenly gripped her hand with surprising strength. His eyes remained closed, but his lips moved. "Don't go. Don't leave me. Don't." Meredith felt her heart tighten painfully. She held his hand and bent close, whispering as she did on the nights Jamie woke from nightmares. "You're not going to die. Do you hear me? You're not going to die. I won't allow it." She stayed there all night without moving, wiping his skin and replacing the cloth, until at last the fever began to break with the coming dawn. When the first pale light slipped through the holes in the warehouse roof, Conrad slowly opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Meredith slumped beside him, asleep, still clutching the damp cloth in her hand, her face weary yet strangely peaceful. He watched her for a long time, noticing the loose strands of hair across her forehead, the roughened skin of her hands, and something unfamiliar rose within his chest. For the first time in many years, someone was beside him, not for money, not for power, not out of fear or ambition, Conrad whispered, his voice hoarse and fragile enough that only the empty basement could hear. Who are you to risk your life for a man like me? Meredith startled awake, her eyes widening in alarm at the sight of daylight. She scrambled to her feet, clumsy with urgency. She had to get home before Jamie woke and found her gone, but before she could run, Conrad caught her hand. His grip was weak, yet his gaze was steady. I need one more thing from you. Find Paul Brennan. He's one of my men. He witnessed the night Martin was killed. Wesley forced him to give false testimony to frame me, but I know Paul still has a conscience. He's living with his guilt. If you find him, you might find the truth to prove I'm innocent. Meredith looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll find him. Finding Paul Brennan wasn't easy, but Meredith still had a few connections from her years at the nightclub. She reached out to Rosa, a former co-worker who had since left that life behind to marry, whose brother tended bar at a place frequented by men from the underworld. After a few phone calls and a small exchange of cash for information, Meredith obtained an address. Paul Brennan was hiding in a run-down apartment on the west side, the kind of place where men went to disappear from their former lives. That afternoon, after leaving Jamie with Mrs. Walsh, under the pretense of taking an extra shift at work, Meredith boarded a bus and rode toward the address Rosa had given her. The apartment was on the third floor of a building even more dilapidated than her own. The stairwell reeked of urine, and the walls were stained with spreading patches of damp. She stopped before door number 37, drew in a steady breath, and knocked. There was movement inside, the crash of something knocked over. Then the door opened a crack. Bloodshot eyes, raw from alcohol and sleepless nights, stared out from a middle-aged man with an unshaven beard and hair like a tangled nest. Paul Brennan looked like a ghost of himself, a man being devoured by his own conscience. Who is it? Did Wesley send you? I did what he said. I didn't talk. His voice trembled, and his hand clutched the door as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. Meredith shook her head, her tone calm but firm. I'm not with Wesley. I'm here because of Conrad Sterling. Paul tried to slam the door, but Meredith was quicker. She wedged her foot into the gap, wincing as the edge crushed against her ankle. He's dying in that basement. Can you live with that? Can you look at yourself in the mirror every day and say you bear no blame? Paul stood frozen, blinking rapidly. Then his grip loosened. He stepped back, offering a silent invitation. The apartment was worse inside. Empty liquor bottles littered the floor. Curtains were drawn tight against the daylight. The air was thick with sour alcohol and unwashed flesh. Paul collapsed onto a torn sofa and reached for a half-empty bottle, pouring into a glass with hands that shook so violently more spilled than filled. You don't understand, he said, his voice breaking. I had no choice. Wesley threatened to kill my wife and daughter if I didn't testify. He showed me pictures of my little girl at school. He knew which school, which class, which desk she sits at. I had to do it. Don't you see? Tears streamed down his weathered face. That night, I was there. I saw everything. Wesley and 2 of his men killed Martin Cross, not Conrad. Conrad wasn't even there. He was set up. Wesley planned it for a long time. He wanted everything his brother had. Meredith listened in silence before asking the question she knew would terrify him. Will you tell the truth? Will you testify to save an innocent man? Paul shook his head violently, tears and desperation mingling. Wesley will kill me. You don't understand. He's insane. He'll kill my family. I can't. Meredith rose and looked down at him. She didn't despise him. She understood fear. She understood what it meant to protect family at any cost. I'm not forcing you, she said softly, but think about how you want your daughter to remember you. As a father who let an innocent man die, or as a man who stood for what was right even while he was afraid. If no one speaks the truth, an innocent man will die in that dark basement, and you'll carry that guilt for the rest of your life. She left her phone number on a scrap of paper and walked out without looking back. On her way home, Meredith thought about what Paul had said regarding the scene of the murder, an alley behind an Italian restaurant on Grand Avenue. She decided to see it for herself, and what she discovered changed everything. Across from the alley stood a small convenience store, Above its entrance was a security camera aimed directly toward the crime scene. Meredith knew she had to obtain that footage. The next day, she dressed in her plainest clothes, tied her hair back neatly, and entered the store wearing the humble expression she had perfected over years of low-wage labor. She asked for a job cleaning, saying she would do anything for the lowest pay. The owner, a middle-aged Korean man, looked her over and agreed to let her try for a day. While wiping down shelves, Meredith observed that the recording computer was kept in a small back room behind the counter. She waited until the owner was distracted with customers, then slipped into the room, her heart pounding wildly. Her hands trembled as she inserted a small flash drive and searched for the footage from the night Martin Cross was killed. She found it. What appeared on the screen stole her breath. Wesley Sterling and two men dragging a body into the alley. No sign of Conrad anywhere. She copied the video, erased traces of access, and slipped back out just before the owner returned. That night, when Meredith approached the warehouse as usual, she sensed something had shifted. The air felt tighter, more guarded. Wesley had begun to suspect something because Conrad wasn't weakening as expected, and security had been increased. As Meredith crept along the fence, she heard heavy footsteps drawing near. She darted behind a large dumpster, pressing herself against the freezing wall, holding her breath. Her heart pounded like a war drum, each beat threatening to give her away. 2 guards passed by. One stopped beside the dumpster where she hid. "You hear something?" he muttered. "Probably a stray cat," the other replied. "Come on, it's freezing. I need a drink." They moved on, but Meredith didn't dare shift. She remained there in the foul darkness behind the trash for 2 full hours until she was certain no one lingered nearby. When she reached home at 5 in the morning, her body trembled from cold and fear, her clothes carrying the stench of garbage. Jamie woke at the sound of the door and ran to her, wrapping his small arms around her waist, shivering at how cold she felt. "Mama, why are you so late? Why are you so cold?" Meredith held him tightly, hiding the tears rising in her throat. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just worked extra hours. Go back to sleep." But after Jamie drifted off again in her arms, Meredith lay awake staring at the dark ceiling, knowing she couldn't let this continue. Wesley would act soon, and if she didn't move faster, Conrad would die in that basement before the truth ever saw the light of day. Meredith understood that she couldn't free Conrad from the warehouse alone, not with Wesley increasing the number of guards. She needed help, and the only person who could truly help her was Frank Novak, the man Conrad had spoken of with absolute trust. Through street whispers and a few discreet inquiries through Rosa, Meredith learned that Frank was still alive but in hiding, staying out of Wesley's reach. He was said to frequent an old bar on the north side, a place where fallen men from the underworld went to drink away memories of former glory. The following evening, Meredith left Jamie with Mrs. Walsh and took a bus north. The bar was called the Rusty Anchor. It sat at the end of a narrow alley, its wooden door worn pale and its neon sign missing half its letters. Inside, cigarette smoke hung thick in the air like a solid wall. Dim yellow light washed over tired faces scattered throughout the room. Meredith spotted Frank Novak immediately. He sat alone in the darkest corner, his back to the wall as though guarding against attack from behind. He was a man in his 50s, his salt and pepper hair cut short, his face carved with lines of time and worry. His eyes were dulled but still sharp with the awareness of someone who had once held power over life and death. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat before him, along with an ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. Meredith drew a steady breath, walked over, and pulled out the chair across from him without asking permission. "Are you Frank Novak?" Frank didn't change expression. He didn't even look up. But beneath the table, Meredith felt something cold and hard press against her knee, metal shifting softly as a finger settled against a trigger. "Who are you?" His voice rumbled like gravel. "Did Wesley send you to test me? Or has he grown impatient and decided to end this quickly?" Meredith swallowed but kept her tone steady. "If I were Wesley's, you'd be dead the moment I walked in. Not sitting here now. He wouldn't send a woman to do this." Frank frowned. His eyes lifted at last to study her face. He was measuring her, weighing her. The gun under the table remained unmoved. Slowly, carefully, Meredith reached into her coat pocket. She moved deliberately so he wouldn't mistake her for drawing a weapon. She placed a silver ring engraved with a lion onto the table, the Sterling family ring. Conrad had slipped it from his finger the last night she saw him and told her to use it to prove she was telling the truth. Frank's reaction told her she had chosen correctly. He froze, His eyes widened as though he were staring at a ghost risen from the grave. His hand trembled as he picked up the ring and turned it beneath the dull yellow light, examining the fine engravings he had seen thousands of times over 20 years at Conrad's side. This ring, his voice faltered. He never took it off. Not to sleep. Not to shower. He's alive? Alive, Meredith answered. Locked in a basement beneath an abandoned warehouse on the south side. Wesley's kept him there for 2 weeks, waiting until his hold on power is secure before finishing him. She placed the small flash drive beside the ring. This is security footage from the night Martin Cross was killed. Wesley and 2 of his men were there. Conrad wasn't. He was set up. Frank took the drive, pulled out his phone, and spent several silent minutes watching the video. When the screen went dark, he sat motionless, shoulders trembling, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "My God," he whispered, the words breaking as if something inside him had been stabbed. I knew Wesley had his issues. I knew he envied his brother. But this, I never thought he'd go this far. Frank looked up at Meredith, his eyes now fully awake and sharp. "Who are you? Why are you helping him? What do you gain from this?" Meredith met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm just a cleaning woman. I'm no one. But 3 years ago, he helped me when I was no one and had nothing to offer in return. I can't ignore that he needs help now." Frank studied her for a long time, searching for deception or hidden motive. He found none, only sincerity and a quiet courage rarer than anything he had seen, even among hardened criminals. "You've got more nerve than most men I know," he said at last, and there was undisguised respect in his voice. "All right. I still have about 15 loyal men Wesley couldn't buy. We'll go in and get him out." Meredith nodded. "I know the warehouse. I know the guard's schedule. I know the entrance and where the basement is. I'll lead you." Frank opened his mouth to object, perhaps to warn her of danger, or tell her to stay home. But when he looked into her steady eyes, he understood that nothing he said would stop her. He exhaled and gave a reluctant nod. "Tomorrow night, Wesley has a meeting downtown with new partners. He won't be at the warehouse. That's our best chance." But the meeting was a ruse, or perhaps a silent alarm had been tripped, for Wesley was already there, waiting in the shadows. He paused, then added, "I'll contact the FBI. There's an agent who's been investigating the Sterling organization for a long time. This is our opportunity to bring Wesley down completely and legally. We won't just save Conrad. We'll get justice." When Meredith returned home that night, the apartment lay in peaceful darkness. She stepped quietly into Jamie's room and watched her son sleeping, clutching the stuffed bear Derek had given him before he died. She bent and kissed his forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of children's shampoo and innocence. "I love you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I love you more than anything in this world." She knew that tomorrow night might be the last time she would see him. She knew she could die. She could be arrested. She might never come back. But she also knew that if she didn't do this, she wouldn't be able to live with herself. She wouldn't be able to look into her son's eyes and teach him about courage and integrity. The fateful night arrived. Meredith sat at the small table in her darkened apartment, weak streetlight filtering through the window and falling across the sheet of paper beneath her trembling hand. "Dear Mrs. Walsh, if I don't return before morning, please take care of Jamie for me. Don't ask why. I've left some money in the cookie tin on the kitchen shelf, enough to provide for him for a few weeks. If I don't come back, please tell Jamie that his mother loves him beyond measure, and that she did what was right. Meredith." She folded the note and slipped it beneath Mrs. Walsh's door, then returned quietly to Jamie's room. Her son was sleeping peacefully, brown curls scattered over the pillow, lips slightly parted, breathing steady in the innocence of a child untouched by the darkness shadowing his mother's life. Meredith knelt beside the bed and studied his angelic face, as if committing every detail to memory. She bent and kissed his forehead, whispering through a tight throat, "I love you. I love you more than anything in this world. No matter what happens, remember that." Then she rose, dressed in the black clothes she had prepared, tied her hair back neatly, and slipped out of the apartment in complete silence. The meeting point was an abandoned parking lot about half a mile from the warehouse. Frank and his 15 loyal men were already there. They were hard-faced men, expressions carved from stone, men who had followed Conrad Sterling for years and had not been bought with money nor intimidated into submission by Wesley. When Meredith arrived, Frank stepped forward and handed her a heavy bulletproof vest. "Put it on," he said in a tone that left no room for argument. "He'll kill me if anything happens to you." Meredith pulled it over her shoulders, feeling the weight press down like a reminder of what awaited them. She nodded once. "Let's go." The sky over Chicago was moonless, a thick black curtain dotted with faint stars swallowed by the city's glow. The group split into 3 units, approaching the warehouse from different directions to avoid detection. Meredith led Frank and 5 others toward the rear entrance she had memorized over many nights. As they neared, Frank signaled them to stop and observe. What they saw tightened every nerve. Instead of 4 guards as Meredith had reported, there were 10 patrolling the perimeter, fully armed and alert. Wesley had changed the rotation earlier than expected, perhaps sensing that something wasn't right. Frank glanced at Meredith, then issued silent hand signals to his men. They moved through the darkness like shadows, without a sound. Minutes later, there were brief muffled noises, then silence again. Meredith didn't ask what had happened to the guards, and she didn't want to know. Frank returned and gave a sharp nod. "Move. We've only got minutes." Meredith ran into the warehouse, her heart hammering violently. She rushed down the basement stairs, stumbling in the dark but refusing to turn on her light until she reached the bottom. Below, Conrad heard approaching footsteps and knew his time had come. After 2 weeks of captivity, torture, and starvation, he had long prepared himself for death. Wesley had finally grown tired of waiting. He lifted his head, steel-gray eyes calm as still water, the gaze of a man who had accepted fate and feared nothing. The basement door swung open. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and then he saw her, Meredith, her face drawn with worry, her eyes blazing with determination. Conrad exhaled in relief, then immediately clenched his jaw in anger. "Are you out of your mind? I told you to find Frank, not charge in here like some reckless fool." Meredith didn't answer. She dropped to her knees beside him and used a key taken from one of the guards to unlock his cuffs. "Frank's outside with 15 men. We don't have time to argue." When the cuffs fell away, Conrad tried to stand, but his legs failed him. 2 weeks of deprivation and restraint had drained him to the core. He staggered, nearly collapsing, and Meredith quickly slid her arm around his waist to steady him. "Lean on me," she said softly but firmly. They climbed the stairs step by step, Conrad bearing nearly all his weight on her slight frame. She endured it without complaint. Outside, Frank and his men were waiting, engines already running on 2 vehicles. "Hurry!" Frank shouted, waving them forward. Conrad and Meredith moved toward the cars. He forced his body forward despite every step feeling like needles piercing his flesh. 20 yards, 15, 10, and then floodlights exploded on from every direction, turning night into blinding day. Engines roared. From the darkness, a convoy of black vehicles surged forward, surrounding them. Wesley Sterling stepped out of the lead car, 15 armed men fanning out behind him, guns raised and aimed at Frank's group. He was younger than Conrad by a few years, but his face carried a cruelty and madness his brother had never possessed. A cold smile curved his lips as he approached, eyes fixed on Conrad with undisguised hatred. "Brother," Wesley's voice rang through the night like a tolling bell. "Did you really think you could escape me? Did you think I wouldn't notice someone helping you all these days?" Conrad pushed Meredith behind him, shielding her with his weakened body, his steel-gray gaze locking onto his brother's without the slightest retreat. The 2 sides faced each other in the darkness, guns aimed at guns, no one daring to move. The tension was suffocating. Each passing second stretched into something that felt like a year. Wesley let out a thin laugh, the sound slicing through the night like the cry of a crow foretelling death. His eyes burned with the madness of a man consumed by ambition and envy. "Brother," he said with open contempt, "look at you, the man who once ruled the city's shadows, rescued by a former dancer. What a disgrace to the Sterling family. Our parents must be ashamed of you." Conrad straightened his back, though every muscle in his body screamed in pain, though 2 weeks of captivity had drained him nearly dry. His eyes locked onto his brother's without retreat. His voice was cold as winter ice. "She has more honor than you've had in your entire life, Wesley. She doesn't betray those who loved and protected her. She doesn't murder friends to steal what isn't hers. She doesn't lock her own brother in a basement to die. You are the disgrace to the Sterling name." Wesley's face twisted with rage, veins pulsing at his temples. He turned toward Meredith, his gaze blazing as if he could reduce her to ash. "And you," he sneered. Who do you think you are? A nightclub stray daring to interfere in sterling family business? Do you even understand who's standing in front of you? Meredith didn't step back, though her heart thundered violently, though her knees trembled with fear. She lifted her chin and met his eyes with steady calm. I may be everything you despise, a woman from the shadows of this city, surviving on what others discard. But there's one thing I have never done and never will do. I don't betray my own. Wesley's fury exploded. Enough. Take them both. Now. His men moved forward, tightening the circle. Frank and his 15 men braced themselves, fingers tightening on triggers, but everyone knew they were outnumbered. If gunfire erupted, it would be slaughter. Conrad took Meredith's hand, his voice low with regret. I'm sorry. I should never have let you get involved. I should have refused your help from the beginning. Meredith laced her fingers through his, holding tight, feeling warmth pass between them. I chose this. No one forced me, and I don't regret it. Then, just as everything seemed lost, sirens tore through the night. Not one, but dozens, wailing from every direction. Police lights flared bright as daylight, flooding the warehouse yard. Above them, helicopter blades thundered across the sky. FBI, drop your weapons. Hands up, on your knees. The amplified command echoed through the chaos as federal agents in black tactical gear swarmed from all sides. Rifles trained on both groups alike. Wesley stood frozen, his rage collapsing into shock. He looked around like a trapped animal, unable to understand how the ground had shifted beneath him. No, that's impossible. How? Frank stepped forward, his expression grim with satisfaction. I contacted the FBI yesterday afternoon, Wesley. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a trap. The security footage of you killing Martin Cross is already in their hands, along with Paul Brennan's testimony. Yes, Paul decided to tell the truth. You've lost. Wesley's eyes darted from Frank to Conrad to Meredith, disbelief and hatred twisting together. His men glanced at one another, then one by one lowered their weapons and raised their hands. No one was willing to die for a fallen king. Federal agents moved in, cuffing Wesley. For the first time in his life, the man who had dreamed of ruling Chicago's underworld bowed in defeat. He was led away still muttering threats and curses that no one cared to hear. Paramedics rushed to Conrad's side, examining his wounds and checking his blood pressure. He was so weak he could barely remain upright, yet his eyes never left Meredith, as though she were the only anchor keeping him standing. Amid the flashing lights, the sirens, and the shouted commands, Meredith stood alone at the edge of the scene, watching it unfold as if in a dream. She had done it. Conrad was free. Wesley was arrested. Justice had come. But as the shock began to settle, another question formed quietly in her mind. What now? Where did any of this lead? What would become of her and Conrad? Or was this the moment she returned to her ordinary life, to Jamie, to scrubbing floors and cleaning toilets, and treated all of it as nothing more than a strange and dangerous dream in the middle of the night? A police car stood a short distance away, Wesley being escorted toward it by 2 FBI agents, his hands cuffed behind his back. Conrad watched his brother's retreating figure, then slowly stepped forward, each movement heavy as though he carried the weight of his wounds and something far deeper. An agent moved to block him, but Frank murmured a few words, and they stepped aside, allowing Conrad one final moment. The brothers faced each other beneath the harsh glare of headlights. One stood free yet battered. The other stood restrained, though physically unbroken. Only a few steps separated them, yet the distance felt like a chasm that could never be crossed. Wesley let out a bitter laugh, the arrogance gone from his face. You always had everything, he said, his voice thick with resentment that had festered for a lifetime. Father loved you more. Mother was prouder of you. Everyone in the organization respected you more. And me? I was always just the name that followed yours. Conrad Sterling's little brother, the shadow behind your light. Conrad stood very still, steel-gray eyes trembling with a pain deeper than any physical injury. When he spoke, his voice no longer carried the icy authority of a mafia boss. It was the voice of an older brother confronting a terrible truth. You were my brother, Wesley, my blood. I would have given you anything, everything, if you had only asked. Why? Why kill Martin? He was our friend since childhood. Why betray me like this? Wesley lifted his head, eyes rimmed red though no tears fell. For a fleeting instant, he wasn't a ruthless traitor. Only a younger brother who had lived his life in envy and quiet shame. Because you had everything without trying, he said, his tone weary now. You only had to exist and people loved you. I worked my whole life for recognition and still stood in your shadow. I hated that. I hated you for it. Conrad shook his head slowly, anguish carving through him. You're wrong. You think I had everything? You think I was happy? I was burdened, lonely, exhausted from carrying what father left on my shoulders. I just hid it better than you did. If you had spoken to me, if you had told me how you felt, I could have. Wesley turned away. Too late, brother. Too late for all of it. The agents guided him into the patrol car. The door shut with a hollow finality. Conrad remained standing as the vehicle pulled away, red taillights blinking before vanishing around the bend. For the first time in his life, the head of the Sterling Empire looked like nothing more than a wounded man. His broad shoulders trembled, his fists clenched. No tears came. He had forgotten how to cry the day his father died, and he became head of the family at 20 years old. Meredith stepped beside him and said nothing. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't ask questions. She simply stood there, a quiet presence in the storm breaking inside him. After a long while, Conrad turned to her. His eyes, once sharp as steel, now held a softness he had never allowed anyone to see. You saved me, he said hoarsely. You risked your life for a man like me. A criminal, a mafia boss with blood on his hands. Why? What did you gain from this? Meredith met his gaze calmly. Because it was the right thing to do, she answered, her voice gentle but unwavering. And because I know what it feels like when the whole world turns its back on you. I know what it's like when no one believes you, when no one wants to help no matter how hard you try. No one deserves to face that alone, not even you. Conrad reached out and took her hand in his, not because he needed support this time, but because he wanted to. I owe you my life, he said with solemn conviction. I'll never forget that. Meredith slowly withdrew her hand, a faint smile touching her lips. I didn't do this to put you in my debt. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Sterling. We're even. Then she turned and walked away into the thinning darkness, leaving Conrad standing beneath the flashing lights, watching her small figure disappear beyond the police cars and ambulances. For the first time in all his years of power and wealth, he didn't know what to do next. He didn't know what words might make her stay. By the time Meredith reached her crumbling apartment, dawn was breaking. Mrs. Walsh sat waiting on the stairs, aged eyes swollen with worry, dried tear tracks marking her wrinkled cheeks. When she saw Meredith, she rose as if to ask questions, but stopped at the sight of Meredith's exhausted face. Everything's all right, Mrs. Walsh, Meredith said quietly. Thank you for watching, Jamie. She stepped inside and went straight to her son's room. Jamie was still asleep, brown curls spread across his pillow, breathing soft and peaceful. Meredith lay down beside him and wrapped her arms around his small body. For the first time after so many nights of fear and tension, she allowed herself to cry. Tears streamed silently down her face, soaking into the pillow, into Jamie's hair, carrying away the fear, the exhaustion, and the fragile relief she had held inside for far too long. In the days following that fateful night, Meredith's life seemed to slip back into its old rhythm. She still rose at 3 a.m. for her night shift. She still scrubbed filthy toilets in office buildings, mopped floors, emptied trash while coworkers whispered behind her back. Yet something had shifted. There was a strange hollow space inside her she couldn't quite name. Sometimes in the middle of her shift, she'd find herself thinking about the dark basement, about those eyes in the beam of her flashlight, about the warmth of his hand holding hers on that final night. Jamie was the one who spoke of Conrad most often. Each evening before bed, he'd look up with clear brown eyes and ask, Mama, is Uncle Conrad better now? Is he still sad? Is he still locked in the dark basement? Meredith would hold him close and say that Uncle Conrad was safe now, that he was home, that he wasn't sad anymore. But deep down, she wasn't sure if that was true. News of Conrad Sterling's return spread across Chicago like wildfire. Every station covered the dramatic reappearance of the Mafia boss, the arrest of his brother Wesley by the FBI on charges of murder and conspiracy. But what stirred the most conversation was Conrad's public declaration that he would gradually transition the Sterling organization into legitimate business. I've seen death too closely, he said in a rare interview. It's time to change. A week after the rescue, Meredith had just returned home from work when there was a knock at her door. She opened it and froze. Conrad Sterling stood in the hallway, dressed in an immaculate black suit that looked painfully out of place against peeling paint and damp-stained walls. "What are you doing here?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. Conrad looked at her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "I came to repay you. I can give you a better life. A safe apartment in a decent neighborhood. A respectable job with fair pay. Money so Jamie can attend a good school instead of a failing public one. You deserve that after everything you've done." Meredith stood silent for a moment, then slowly shook her head. "Thank you. But no." Conrad blinked, stunned. "Why? You risked your life for me. You nearly died because of me. I didn't do it for money." Meredith interrupted gently but firmly. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Sterling. I've taken care of myself and my son for years. I'll continue to do so." "This isn't pity," Conrad said, and there was a note of urgency in his voice he had never used before. "It's gratitude. It's the right thing to do." Meredith offered him the first genuine smile since that night. "You want to repay me? Then live better. Be worthy of the second chance you've been given. Become the man you want to be, not the man circumstances forced you to become. That's enough for me." And with that, she gently closed the door, leaving Conrad Sterling alone in the dim hallway, staring at the chipped wood as though struck by lightning. All his life, people had wanted something from him: money, power, protection, privilege. But this woman, who had risked everything to save him, wanted nothing at all. She refused every gift he could offer, and that refusal stayed with him. In the days that followed, Conrad didn't return to Meredith's apartment, but he began appearing in the places she frequented: the small cafe near her building where she occasionally bought herself a cheap cup of coffee as a rare indulgence, the grocery store where she shopped for their meals, the little park where Jamie played on weekend afternoons. He remained at a distance, sitting in his car or on a bench, never approaching, never speaking, simply watching like a silent guardian. And each time he saw Meredith laugh with Jamie, each time he heard the boys' bright laughter ring through the park, something inside him warmed, as though a small flame had begun to flicker within a heart that had been frozen for far too many years. That Sunday afternoon, pale autumn sunlight spilled gently across the small park near the south side. Jamie's laughter rang bright and clear as he pumped his legs on the swing, the sound floating through the quiet air. Meredith sat on a worn wooden bench, her eyes heavy from too little sleep. Yet she didn't let her gaze leave her son for even a second. She watched him the way mothers do when they've known loss, as though if she blinked, he might vanish. She didn't notice the sleek black car parked across the street. She didn't see the tall figure walking slowly along the park path. But Jamie did. He slowed his swing, then stopped altogether. His brown eyes widened with sudden joy. "Uncle Conrad." He jumped down and ran across the grass with such speed that Meredith sprang to her feet in alarm. Jamie barreled into Conrad, wrapping both arms around his leg with the fearless affection of a child who knew nothing of boundaries or social distance. Conrad froze, his hands hovering awkwardly in the air. In 37 years of life, he had never learned how to handle children. He could command an empire, issue orders to hundreds of men, negotiate deals worth millions. But standing before a 5-year-old who clung to him as though he belonged there, he was utterly unprepared. Jamie looked up, grinning. "Are you better now? Are you still in the dark basement? I missed you." Conrad finally lowered his hand and rested it lightly on the boy's curls. "I'm better now, thanks to your mother. I'm not in the basement anymore." Jamie grabbed his hand and tugged him toward the swings. "Will you push me?" "Mama pushes, but not as high as my dad used to." Conrad glanced toward Meredith. She stood a few steps away, watchful but not unkind. After a brief pause, she gave the slightest nod. Conrad lifted Jamie onto the swing and began to push, gently at first, then higher. The boys' laughter filled the crisp air, bright as wind chimes, and Conrad realized it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in years. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself enjoying something simple and pure. When Jamie grew tired of swinging, he slid down and took Conrad's hand, leading him around the park to point out wildflowers and sparrows hopping along branches. Questions poured out in endless curiosity. "What do you do for work? Do you have kids? What's your favorite color? Do you like chocolate ice cream?" Conrad answered each one patiently, surprised by his own patience. The man known for his cold reserve now stood in a public park, discussing whether he preferred blue or red. Then Jamie stopped abruptly, his young face suddenly serious. "Did you know my dad?" His name was Derek. He died. Mama says he went to heaven with the angels. Conrad felt something tighten in his chest. He knelt so they were eye to eye. I didn't know your dad, Jamie, but I know your mother. And I think your dad must have been a very good man, because your mother loved him very much. Jamie nodded, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. Mama cries when she thinks I'm asleep. She misses him. But I don't tell her I know, because I don't want her to be more sad. Conrad swallowed hard. He placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. Your mother is very brave. She's done very hard things to protect you, and she loves you more than anything in the world. Jamie looked up with solemn certainty. My mom is the best person in the world, Conrad smiled, a real smile that softened his entire face. I think so too. Meredith approached, her tone gentle but signaling the end. Jamie, it's time to go home. She glanced briefly at Conrad as if his presence were incidental. Wait. Conrad rose to his feet. Meredith paused but didn't turn. I didn't come here to repay you, he said carefully, as though learning to speak honestly for the first time. I didn't come out of guilt or obligation. I came because I wanted to see you. Meredith turned then, her gray-blue eyes studying him. You're the first person in many years who looked at me like I was just a man. Not a boss. Not something to fear. Not a machine for money. Just a man. I don't quite know what to do with that. Meredith was quiet for a long moment. Neither do I. We come from very different worlds, Mr. Sterling. I know, he nodded. But I'd like to try, if you'll allow me. Before she could answer, Jamie ran back and grabbed both their hands, pulling them closer together with innocent determination. Mama, can Uncle Conrad have dinner with us? I like him. He pushes really high. Meredith looked down at her son, then at Conrad, then back at her son. The silence stretched long and fragile. All right, she said at last, her voice reluctant yet softened by something unspoken. But just tonight. Conrad's smile brightened his solemn features. Just tonight. That dinner was meant to happen only once. Just tonight, she had said. Yet just tonight quietly became many evenings after that. Conrad began appearing at Meredith's small apartment each afternoon, after Jamie finished school, carrying bags of fresh groceries she'd never been able to afford. He sat beside the boy at the kitchen table, helping with homework with a patience that surprised even him. He learned to cook in her tiny kitchen, though the first few attempts ended with burnt pots and nearly triggered the building's fire alarm. He learned to read bedtime stories, his deep, commanding voice softening into something warm and gentle as he brought knights and princesses to life. Meredith would stand outside Jamie's bedroom door and watch Conrad sitting at her son's bedside with a book in his hands, and something inside her would slowly thaw, like ice yielding to the first light of spring. But beyond that small apartment, the world was not kind. Rumors about Conrad Sterling and the mysterious woman spread through Chicago like wildfire. Among the elite circles Conrad had known through business deals and lavish parties, whispers began. In private clubs and glittering gatherings, people spoke with undisguised disdain. I hear he's seeing some former nightclub dancer. What a disgrace to the Sterling name. Even a few of Conrad's own men murmured behind his back. He's blinded by some cheap dancer. She must be after his money. Conrad heard it all. He knew it all, and he didn't care. What he did care about was showing Meredith that his world didn't have to be only darkness and hypocrisy. A month after that first dinner, Conrad invited Meredith to a charity gala for orphan children at a 5-star hotel in downtown Chicago. Meredith wore a simple dark blue dress she had found at a thrift store, her hair pinned neatly to reveal the elegant line of her neck. She wore no expensive jewelry, no dramatic makeup. She was beautiful in a quiet, honest way, like a wildflower among cultivated orchids. But the wealthy women in designer gowns and diamond necklaces looked at her as though she were an insect that had wandered into their celebration. They whispered behind feathered fans, their laughter sharp and deliberate. Conrad introduced Meredith to several acquaintances. She felt the tension in every cool handshake, every artificial smile. Then the inevitable happened. A middle-aged woman in a striking red gown and a string of pearls approached, speaking loudly enough for others nearby to hear. So this is the girl Conrad Sterling is keeping now? Who do you think you are? A cheap club dancer from the slums trying to climb into a mafia boss's bed for a better life? You should know your place and go back where you belong. The room fell silent. Curious, hungry eyes turned toward Meredith, waiting for spectacle. Meredith didn't react. Her expression remained as still as the surface of an autumn lake. She quietly set her wineglass down and walked out of the ballroom, leaving Conrad standing there with fury blazing in his eyes. He found her on the balcony, gazing over the shimmering lights of Chicago below, the night breeze lifting loose strands of her hair. "I'm sorry," Conrad said, regret thick in his voice. "They had no right to speak to you like that." Meredith shook her head and turned to him, her eyes glistening though no tears had yet fallen. "No, they had every right. Because it's true, Mr. Sterling. I was a nightclub dancer. I sold my body, sold my dignity so my mother could afford treatment and live a few more years. That's the truth. I can't erase it." She turned away, her voice unsteady. "I can't exist in your world. I don't belong here. All I do is embarrass you in front of your peers." Anger surged in Conrad's chest, not toward her but toward the entire hollow world that judged her. "You think I care what they think?" he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "The people in there? They come for my money and influence. They smile to my face and stab me behind my back. Not one of them came looking for me when my own brother locked me in a basement to die. Not one." He stepped closer and took her small hands in his. "Do you know who did? You. A cleaning woman with calloused hands and more courage than anyone I've known. You risked your life for a stranger. You asked for nothing. Expected nothing." He lifted her hand and pressed it against his chest, where his heart beat hard beneath her palm. "I've lived my whole life in darkness, surrounded by people who only wanted my power. I never knew what it felt like to be cared for because of who I am, not because of what I own. Then you appeared, with nothing but honesty and heart. I don't need you to be anyone else, Meredith. I don't need you to change. I just need you, exactly as you are." Tears finally fell down Meredith's cheeks, the first she had allowed herself to shed in front of a man since Derek died. For the first time in 2 long years, she felt truly loved. Not out of pity, not out of gratitude. Not because of what she had done, simply for who she was. Conrad reached up and brushed the tears from her face, his fingers trembling. "Give me the chance to be with you and Jamie. Not because I owe you my life, but because I love you, Meredith. I love you." Meredith looked at him for a long moment, into steel gray eyes now softened like velvet, into the face of a powerful man who had opened his heart like a child. Then she nodded, gently but with certainty. "All right, but don't disappoint me." Conrad smiled, the brightest smile of his life. "I won't." 6 months after that promise on the hotel balcony, the small St. Patrick Church where Father Thomas Murphy held Sunday Mass was adorned simply with white and yellow wildflowers. The wedding wasn't lavish, as people might have imagined for a mafia boss. There were no hundreds of guests, no grand reception in a 5-star ballroom. Only the closest souls filled the worn wooden pews polished smooth by time. Frank Novak stood in a rare black suit. Mrs. Walsh wore the floral dress she had preserved since her own wedding 40 years earlier. A few of Meredith's old friends from her nightclub days sat quietly together, and a small group of Conrad's most loyal men, those who had walked with him through darkness toward something brighter, bore witness in respectful silence. Conrad stood at the altar in a tailored black suit, elegant but understated. His eyes never left the church doors. When they slowly opened and afternoon sunlight poured in, his heart seemed to stop. Meredith stepped inside wearing a simple white gown she and Mrs. Walsh had sewn together over the course of a month. Her chestnut hair fell naturally over her shoulders. No jeweled crown, no glittering necklace. Only a single white wildflower tucked gently behind her ear. She looked like something out of a dream Conrad had never allowed himself to imagine. Beside her walked Jamie in a tiny suit, gripping his mother's hand with solemn pride. At 6 years old, he understood that this was the most important day of her life. He led her down the aisle with small but steady steps. When they reached Conrad, Jamie carefully placed his mother's hand into his, with all the gravity of a grown man. Frank stood beside Conrad as witness, his aged eyes shining. "You deserve happiness, sir. You truly do." Father Thomas began the ceremony, his warm voice filling the quiet sanctuary. When it was time for vows, Conrad turned to Meredith and clasped her hands tightly. His voice trembled, but every word was clear. "I promise to protect you and Jamie with everything I have, with every breath and every beat of this heart. Not because you saved my life in that dark basement, but because you saved my soul. Before you, I was only surviving, existing in shadows and loneliness. Because of you, I learned how to love, how to trust, how to see that life is worth living." Meredith looked at him, her gray-blue eyes shimmering with tears, her smile radiant as sunlight. "I don't need you to become someone else. I don't need you to be perfect. I only need you to be honest with me, to stand beside me in good days and hard ones, and to love my son as your own. That's all I ask." When Father Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, and Conrad bent to kiss her, the small church filled with applause and quiet sobs. But the most beautiful moment was yet to come. After the ceremony, Conrad didn't hurry outside. Instead, he turned to Jamie and slowly knelt on one knee upon the cool church floor so their eyes were level. "Jamie," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you had a wonderful father who loved you and your mother very much. I'll never replace your dad, Derek, but I promise I'll always protect you and your mom. I promise I'll stay. I won't leave. Will you let me be your father too?" Jamie stood still for a heartbeat, his brown eyes searching Conrad's face. Then suddenly he threw his arms around Conrad's neck and held on tight, tears spilling freely. "I've been waiting for you. For a long time. I miss having a dad." Conrad gathered the boy into his arms, his broad shoulders shook, his eyes burned, and for the first time in over 20 years, tears rolled down the face of the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. Meredith watched her husband and her son, tears streaming down her cheeks, her smile brighter than anything she had ever known. She knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around both. The three of them held each other in a warm embrace at the front of the small church. The room fell silent except for Mrs. Walsh, quietly dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, and Frank turning away to hide his own tears. Father Thomas stood at the altar, smiling with deep contentment. "This is the true miracle," he murmured. "Not turning water into wine, but turning broken hearts into a whole family." When they stepped out of the church, Conrad held Meredith's hand firmly in one of his, while Jamie sat proudly on his shoulders. Golden autumn sunlight bathed the three of them, casting long shadows across the pavement. A new family had begun, born from darkness, shaped by hardship, and blossoming at last in love. 5 years after their wedding day, the life of the Sterling family had transformed so completely, it felt like a dream Meredith would never have dared imagine, back when she was scrubbing office toilets at 4 a.m. Their home now stood in a quiet suburb of Chicago, a spacious house with a wide green lawn, a white fence, and flower beds bursting with color that Meredith tended with her own hands each morning. Conrad had kept his promise. He gradually shifted most of his operations into legitimate ventures, including a real estate company, a chain of Italian restaurants, and a transportation firm. He still held influence in Chicago's underworld, because no one erases a past overnight, but he no longer involved himself directly in illegal dealings. Frank Novak remained at his side as a trusted advisor, now officially retired, spending Sunday afternoons teaching Jamie how to play chess. Meredith turned the pain of her past into purpose. The new Dawn Center she founded had become a refuge for more than 200 women over 5 years. She taught them sewing, baking, basic computer skills. She arranged legal support for victims of domestic abuse. Most of all, she showed them that their past didn't define their future. Many of those women now had steady jobs, new lives, and futures brighter than they'd ever imagined. Their small family had grown. Jamie was now 10, strong, bright, and playing basketball for his school team. When classmates asked about his father, he answered with shining pride that his dad was the best man in the world. Conrad and Meredith had 2 more blessings. Nina, 3 years old, with her mother's gray-blue eyes and her father's dark hair, and little Henry, just 1 year old, with a smile identical to Conrad's, Mrs. Walsh had moved in with them, lovingly called Grandma, happier than she had ever been, surrounded by children's laughter each day. There was one thing Meredith knew Conrad had done quietly all these years. Wesley had been sentenced to 25 years for murder and conspiracy. Conrad never visited him in prison, but every month he ensured Wesley's legal representation was properly funded so his brother would be treated fairly. When Meredith once asked why he would do that after such betrayal, Conrad simply looked into the distance and said in a quiet voice that Wesley was still his brother. Blood couldn't be erased. He might not forgive what Wesley had done, but he couldn't forget the years they had grown up side by side after their father died. Meredith said nothing more. She simply held her husband's hand and understood that this was how he healed. One Sunday afternoon, the whole family sat on the porch. Golden light spread across the lawn where Jamie was teaching Nina to kick a soccer ball. Henry sat on Conrad's lap, tiny fingers tugging playfully at his father's tie. "Missus," Walsh rocked gently in her chair, knitting, her old eyes glowing with contentment. Jamie ran up the steps, sweaty and bright-eyed. "Mom, tell the story again about how I found Dad in the basement. I want to hear it." Nina clapped eagerly. "Me too." Meredith smiled, and began the tale as she had many times before, softened for children, yet true at heart. A brave little boy named Jamie who found a man in need. A mother who chose to do what was right even though it was dangerous. A lost man who learned how to love because someone believed in him. When she finished, Meredith looked at Jamie with deep affection. "And that's how you helped save our family. If it weren't for you, I never would have known your father was there." Jamie puffed up proudly. But Conrad shook his head. His eyes misted as he looked at his wife. "No," he said softly. "Your mother saved all of us. She saved me when I had no hope left. She taught me how to love when I had forgotten what love was." He turned to his children, his voice steady and tender. "Remember this. Never judge someone by their past, by what they once did, or where they came from. Look at their heart. Look at what they're doing now, and who they're trying to become. Your mother taught me that lesson, and I want you to learn it too." As the sun dipped low, painting the Chicago sky in shades of orange and violet, Meredith rested her head against Conrad's shoulder and watched her children's laughter ripple across the yard. She thought of the 21-year-old girl who once stood trembling outside a nightclub, heartbroken and afraid. That girl had never dared dream of a warm home like this, a husband who loved her like this, children like these. Life had taught her something precious. Life never asks where you came from. It doesn't care how many times you fell, or how dark your past once was. It asks only one question: how far are you willing to go, and do you have the courage to do what is right? The story of Meredith, Conrad, and Jamie will always stand as proof of that truth. The past doesn't define your future. Redemption can come from hands the world has rejected, and true love never asks where you came from. It only asks how deeply you're willing to love. Thank you for walking beside Meredith and Conrad through this journey of heart and hardship. Do you believe in second chances? Have you ever seen someone transform their life the way Meredith did? Share your thoughts from the depths of your heart. If this story touched you, please like, share it with those you love, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story we bring. We wish you good health, peace, and happiness each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again soon.